Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Racha Kodesh. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Wisdom of Solomon, the 19th chapter. As for the ungodly, wrath came upon them without mercy unto the end. See, so when you read in the 18th chapter, it shows the comparison of how when Israel tasted of the death, it was temporary, right? The Lord still delivered us. But with the ungodly, it says it came onto them, onto the end, so completely to their destruction. For he knew before what they would do. See, so the Lord knew that these wicked demons, they weren't gonna change their ways. Right, reading this as well in the GNTD, it says, but the godless continued to feel your pitiless anger until the very end. You knew what they would do before they did it. Verse 2, now that now that having given them leave to depart and sent them hastily, they would repent and pursue them. See, so the Lord already knew that, because he was the one hardening their hearts to do so. So they gave us leave to depart, to leave Egypt, and they drove us out of there hastily, and then they turned around, repented of that decision, and then pursued after us. For whilst they were yet mourning and making lamentation at the graves of the dead, they added another foolish device. That was another foolish plan, and pursued them as fugitives, whom they had entreated to be gone. So while they were still mourning the loss of their firstborns, they thought, you know what, let's actually go back after them again. Because we just gave away all our slaves. Let's go back and get them again. That was another foolish device. And so they pursued us as fugitives, whom they had entreated. They basically begged us to leave. For the destiny whereof they were worthy drew them on to this end. So this happened, the Lord set this up because this was their end. This was their destiny, that they would suffer this fate. That is what drew them onto this end, right? That they should pursue Israel eventually into the Red Sea and then die. And made them forget the things that had already happened. See, because the Lord hardened their hearts. You just forgot that the Lord just is, for these same very people's sake, all your firstborns are dead. And you thought, you know what? Let's go after them anyway. It says that they might fulfill the punishment which was wanting to their torments. Wanting meaning lacking. So the punishment that was remaining to be added onto their torments, the little icing on the cake, that was for them to die in the Red Sea. So in order to fulfill that, the Lord put in their spirit to forget all the things that just happened and to still go and chase after Israel. And that thy people might pass a wonderful way, but they might find a strange death. So we were walking on dry land to be delivered. They, however, were about to have the worst time of their short life and drown. For the whole creature of in his proper kind was fashioned again anew, serving, and the creature here is talking about the elements here. It was meaning like the Lord changed the nature of the elements, serving the peculiar commandments that were given unto them, that thy children might be kept without hurt. So the Lord caused the water in the Red Sea, for an example, to work against how water naturally works. And in commanding it, that's what it means by a new fashion. So he commanded it by a peculiar commandment for it to become like a wall and not to actually just flow in, so that we would be preserved and not hurt. As namely a cloud shadowing the camp, and where water stood before, dry land appeared. See? So when we were at the part of the Red Sea or the Gulf of Suez, the Lord had that water stand up. So that water that was before us became dry land. And there was a wall on one side and a wall on the other side of water. And out of the Red Sea, a way without impediment. See, out of the Red Sea, there was now a path for us to walk without anything blocking our way. and out of the violent stream a green field, which just signifies that violent stream or that body of water now became a safe passage for us. Verse 8, where through all the people went and were defended with thy hand, seeing thy marvelous strange works or strange wonders. So as we went in the book of Exodus, it tells you that the chariot that was with us went behind us and it was discomfiting the Egyptians, right? Probably shooting laser beams at them, taking off their chariot wheels and keeping them at distance from us. For they went at large like horses and leaped like lambs, praising thee, O Lord, who hadst delivered them, right? So we went, happy and joyous, praising the Lord as we went, because he had delivered us. For they were yet mindful of the things that were done while they sojourned in the strange land, right? So we remembered the things we suffered in the land of Egypt, and then also the plagues that were happening over there, how the ground brought forth flies instead of cattle, and how the river cast up a multitude of frogs instead of fishes. The ground casting up flies instead of cattle doesn't mean that normally cattle don't come out of the ground anyway. Cattle don't grow out of the ground. What it means is rather than the earth bringing forth the things that are sustainable, right? Like for example, the grass, right, or pasture for the cattle. Instead, as it says, it brought forth flies. So the ground is referring to the earth and really the land. So instead of having, your cattle and grazing and so on, the Lord instead brought the plague of flies. And how the river cast up a multitude of frogs instead of fishes. So they weren't getting any fish to eat. Instead, they had frogs coming up, invading their whole land, their ovens, their beds, everything. But afterwards, they saw a new generation of fowls. When being led with their appetite, they asked delicate meats, and that was the quail that the Lord gave us. For quails came up onto them from the sea for their contentment, right? To delight, to content them, even though they were being unappreciative of the Lord, he still blessed us with the quail. And punishments came upon the sinners, not without former signs, by the force of thunders. For they suffered justly according to their own wickedness, in so much as they used a more hard and hateful behavior toward strangers. This is talking about the Egyptians. They suffered punishments, right? Punishments came upon the sinners, not without former signs, because they saw the plagues that hit them before. Ultimately, the ultimate plague that hit them, right? It says by the force of thunders, for they suffered justly. So their suffering was deserved according to their own wickedness. They were being paid back for their wickedness, in so much as they used a more hard and hateful behavior toward strangers. This is talking about how they entreated Israel wickedly, because we were strangers in their land, and we were first received, but then they ended up treating us as slaves. For the Sodomites did not receive those whom they knew not when they came, right? Dealing with the people in Sodom, right? Dealing Sodom and Gomorrah at that time. It says here, they didn't even receive, they didn't welcome those that came to their land, but these brought friends into bondage that had well deserved of them. See, so it's saying for the Sodomites, at least they just didn't even receive these people, right, that came into their land, right? They didn't welcome them, they didn't receive them in. But these Egyptians, however, they did something worse in that they brought us in as friends and then turned our dwelling there into bondage and turned us into slaves that had well deserved of them, right? So basically we didn't deserve this, but they did that to us, and that was their greater sin. And not only so, but peradventure some respect shall be had of those, because they used strangers not friendly, right? And I'll read verse 15 in the GNTD as well. I saw Wisdom of Solomon chapter 19 verse 15. It says, every nation, I'm actually going to start at 14. It says, other people had been known to refuse to refuse welcome to strangers who came to them. But these people made slaves of those who were their guests and who had showed them kindness. Talking about Israel, they made us slaves. Every nation will be punished if it does not welcome foreigners. So where we at? Verse 16. But these very grievously afflicted them whom they had received with feasting, and were already made partakers of the same laws with them. So basically, us, Israel, that they received us, with feasting and joy, going back to when Joseph brought his, Jacob and the rest of Israel into the land, and we had been made partakers of the same laws with them. What that means is that we were living in the same land, right? When you move to a new country, you are now under the same laws of the land, right? What that means is you're dwelling with them in the same place. So they dealt with us very grievously. They afflicted us, whom they had received with feastings, and we were already made partakers of the same laws with them, right? We were dwelling together with them in the same land. Therefore, even with blindness were these stricken. This is talking about what verse is this? Verse 17. Going back to the comparison between the Egyptians and also those of Sodom, right? It says, therefore, even with blindness were these stricken, as those were at the door of the unrighteous man, right? So this is talking about the Egyptians were also struck with blindness through that darkness that they were put in, just like those wicked men during the time of Lot, who were trying to, abuse the angels that came to Lot. So as those were at the door of the righteous man, that is the account of Lot, when he took in the angels, and then you had these the wicked men of Sodom trying to come in there, and so the angels pulled Lot back and they blinded the men at the door. When being compassed about with horrible great darkness, everyone sought the passage of his own doors. So I'm going to read this in the GNTD as well. It says, these people were also struck with blindness when the men of Sodom who came to the door of that righteous man, or like the men of Sodom who came to the door of that righteous man Lot, they found themselves in total darkness, as each one groped around to find his own door. And that's when the Lord had plagued them with this great darkness, this thick darkness, where they couldn't see anything. So they were groping, like feeling their hands all over the place to try and find their own doors. For the elements were changed in themselves by a kind of harmony, like as in a psaltery, notes change the name of the tune, and yet are always sounds. So basically, you can have music; it's still music, but it has different sounds based on which notes are played, which may well be perceived by the sight of the things that have been done. Okay, so in a nutshell, or in other words, what verse 18 is saying is just like music changes tunes, but remains music. You play one key, one note, it's a different tune, but it's still music. Likewise, the natural elements changed their behavior, right, under the commandment of the Lord, but they were still the same elements. Fire was now able to burn on water. The Lord had like hail burning in fire, but it didn't melt. So all of these things, it was like a changing of the way the elements behaved to make these plagues more intense, but they were still the same elements. Verse 19, for earthly things were turned into watery, and the things that before swam in the water now went upon the ground. Okay, so basically you had these elements that were working almost out of nature, right? The things that usually have power on the earth were also, that's the earthly things, were turned into watery, like how you had fire that was able to burn on the water, right? Solomon mentioned that. And the things that before swam in the water now went upon the ground, right? Having those, which I think some frogs are amphibians, right? They can dwell on both land and water, but mainly you would see them in the water, right? And now they were all coming out the water, invading the land, plaguing the people. Verse 20, the fire had power in the water, forgetting his own virtue. See, like I just described. And the water forgot his own quenching nature. So that was an example of the changing of the behavior of these elements. Even though fire was still fire, it was now burning in water, or in like it says, in the water, and the water that usually quenches the fire wasn't doing that. That's why it says the water forgot his own quenching nature. Scientifically, the water should put out the fire, but in this case, it wasn't. On the other side, the flames wasted not the flesh of the corruptible living things, though they walked therein, neither melted they the icy kind of heavenly meat that was of nature apt to melt. All right, what that's saying is, sometimes, like when we read, I think it was a previous chapter, 18 or 17th chapter, it mentions that the flames, as it says here, wasted not the flesh of the corruptible living things, though they walked therein. So sometimes the fire would calm down a bit, so the beasts and stuff that the Lord sent amongst, to plague the Egyptians wouldn't be burnt up in it. But it also mentions here that fire, neither melted they the icy kind of heavenly meat, dealing with the manna that was of nature apt to melt. So something that naturally was meltable, right, like that manna, because we read about how the sun, basically melted it, was able to survive under, these conditions, but it was to be preserved for Israel, right? So in conditions where it should have melted, it didn't, until Israel was able to gather the things that they needed to gather. Why? Because the Lord was controlling the elements, and likewise, that's why he would be able to say, on the sixth day, gather double, and it would be fine. But if you try to gather more on any other day, it would rot. So what Solomon is doing here is he's comparing, Israel in the wilderness, how the Lord manipulated the elements, to move out of their natural order in order to accomplish what he wanted here, whether it was plaguing the Egyptians or whether it was preserving Israel. Verse 22, for in all things, O Lord, thou didst magnify thy people and glorify them, neither didst thou lightly regard them, but didst assist them in every time and place. And we witness that, when you go and read in the Torah, you'll see many examples of that. But that brings us to the end of the book of Wisdom of Solomon, the 19th chapter, and the end of the entirety of the book of Wisdom of Solomon. Lord willing, that was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Bracha Kodesh. And until next time, Shalom.